Welcome to Non-Toxic. I'm your host, Daniel Penny. On this episode, we're going to be going back to the origins of the concept of toxic masculinity. In episode 1, we talked to Dr. Terry Coopers, who helped popularize the term toxic masculinity in his academic research about violence in prisons. But the phrase comes from a few decades before he popularized it and was born in the mythopoetic men's movement. This was a coalition of therapists, poets, writers, thinkers, mostly based in California, but not exclusively, who led a series of weekend retreats and gatherings that helped men tap into their ancient inner wild men. And a lot of the ideas of the mythopoets around the relationships between masculinity and nature, I think, are quite interesting, especially at a time when we seem to be seeing a resurgence among millennials who are interested in this kind of masculine retreat. I get ads for this kind of stuff like Sacred Sons all the time. And I've been curious where these people came from. I reached out to Ian MacKenzie, who is the host of the Mythic Masculine podcast.
When your ego is consciously traumatized by such an encounter with such a vastness, and in the absence of eldership and mentorship, which is rightly gathering you back in from such an encounter, who helps you actually make meaning of that, which is that you yourself are not the center of the story, right? That there's a much bigger story out there called life itself.
And he's been interviewing figures from this world for 5 years. He's become quite an expert, and he's also a practitioner himself of various types of men's work. So I thought he'd be a great person to talk to. Ian offered some fantastic insight into the history of this movement, as well as where he thinks it's going. I think there's plenty for everyone. Enjoy. All right. Ian, thanks so much for making some time this morning, Vancouver time, this evening in the UK. Glad we were able to connect. So, as I said in the email, I'm working on this article for GQ about the history of the term toxic masculinity. And in the research that I've been doing, I found that it's actually very much intertwined with the history of the mythopoetic men's movement. And so it made me want to do a little more digging into the mythopoetic men's movement. And I think to start, it might be useful to just define some terms. So I'll put it to you. What defines the mythopoetic men's movement?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Good to be here. And it might be helpful, the listener, and again, you may sketch this out in your article, it sounds like, but my sort of lightning context for the mythopoetic men's movement, having also interviewed some of the fellows at the epicenter of it, it largely corresponds with the period somewhat in the late 80s that really got going with Robert Bly, the American poet, who of course was very well known still at the time, or already at the time, that he ended up being drawn into myth and masculinity. And he published the book Iron John. It's sort of like the book zero of the mythopoetic men's movement, it seems, which draws upon a Grimm's fairy tale. And he kind of revives it with a kind of modern lens on modern masculinity, what it might mean, how things got it the way they are, the cultural poverties that have accrued to modern masculinity, and what could be done about it through the lens of myth.
Once upon a time, there was a king and a queen, and they lived in a castle. And near the castle, there was a forest. You know, there's always a forest near the castle.
Now, he had a teacher who was Marie-Louise von Franz, who was the first one, I understand, who began really applying the term exegesis, basically using myth to elaborate in this way, like in a sort of inner landscape of one's psychology. Her teacher was Carl Jung, So again, this whole lineage is, I think, an important. But as far as the quote mythopoetic men's movement, yeah, Robert Bly, James Hillman, psychologist, as well as Michael Mead are somewhat credited as the founders. Martin Shaw's terms, also who was a student of Bly's, he says the three-headed hydra of the mythopoetic men's movement was those three men. And so in terms of what is the DNA of it, I think there's this link certainly between the archetype, also a term coined by Jung, the archetype of the primordial wild man as captured in Iron John and the tale of essentially dragging a shaggy-haired beast, from the forest into the castle, and his connection with a young boy, and what that all means for essentially men in modern times to connect with, I would almost call it the undomesticated primordial beast that, let's say, lies within them all. And I think it's important as well that, again, there's lots of critiques around the mythopoetic men's movement that are largely accrued to white middle-class men, that it kept out, a lot of other perspectives, kind of falls into binaries, like today, a lot of the language around, binary masculinity and all this universal masculinity, it wasn't really around then, right, in the same way. And I think it's easy to critique then with the lenses that are more trendy now. But I do think there is something deeply profound about this. I would just call it a longing for a sense of mythic meaning that so many men carry, and that modern culture, by and large, does not provide. And so for Bly to make that link to this primordial wild man as this aspect of masculinity, either ignored within dominant culture, right, and sort of buried under the domestic life, or it's sort of becomes feral, in which case we see the mass violence in relationships, perpetuated by men, that in many ways is the result of not making a place for this aspect of the undomesticated primordial wild man at the core of masculinity, is one way to think about it.
How did the key thinkers, the three-headed hydra, as you referred to it, how did they come together? What was the context in which they were kind of all discussing masculinity, and what were the specific historical or cultural circumstances that birthed this movement?
Yeah, I'd say, I've done a certain amount of research into this. I've been able to interview, for example, one of the co-founders of Mankind Project, Bill Koth, who's credited again with, in that sense, that's a particular organizational response to the cultural moment, and it continues to operate successfully to today. And I can just say the conditions that he spoke to, I think he's in his 70s now as well, but Bly at the time was also one of his mentors, or at least not directly, but was showing a kind of mentorship. And he said he was working in, I believe it was psychology or psychotherapy, and this is now like in the 70s, right? I believe late 70s. And the women's lib, second wave feminism was, up and running, and bras were burning, and a real sense of women reclaiming their power in this way. And he said there was a sense that it was this, well, this is what the women are doing, and they were looking to the men saying, well, what are you going to do now? Kind of over to you. What's your response to this? And he was like, oh shit, we got to do something about this. And so he joined with two others. I believe one was an ex-military guy, and I can't remember who the third, what his particular offering was, but they crafted together a initiatory weekend, which they initially called the Wild Man Weekend, actually based on, I believe, the work of Bly. And I remember Bill recounts this story in the interview I did with him, where he says they had their first weekend and really did, a kind of attempt at basically a hero's journey, an initiatory rites of passage, which by and large most modern men don't have anymore because we don't have the cultural frameworks for it. So they were trying to reanimate this. And afterwards, they felt it was successful. So he says they wrote a postcard or a letter to Bly actually and said, hey, I just want to let you know, thank you so much for what you've done to inspire us. We had our first Wild Man weekend. It was, great success. Kind of like, what do you think, Dad? It's kind of what Bill says, right? What do you think, Dad? Do you approve? And apparently Bly said, great, glad you're doing it. Just don't call it the Wild Man weekend, because he said it will attract all sorts of criticism and, misunderstanding and all this stuff.
One of the concepts that we've touched on, but I think it's important to kind of go a little deeper here, is just this idea of the retreat, or the natural environment that's somehow away from the regular domestic routine. Why is this a central idea, or maybe you might even say it's the foundation for the mythopoets? Were they, environmentalists, or were they just kind of picking up on the nascent environmentalist movement of the time? Why was nature so crucial to them and in their formulation of a new masculinity?
Well, I think that, and again, this is drawing also upon the work that I've done as very much picking up a lot of these threads where there has to be what do I call it? Almost like like a reconnection to a core sense of, I mean, I call it eros, right? Eros as the vitality of the natural world itself, and oftentimes kind of collapsed into a narrow expression or understanding of simply sexual love, right? As eros, of course, the foundation of the word erotic. But eros as a connection to life energy, and also the connection to the wildness, that can be misconstrued a lot and fall into these tropes, right? That can easily, just become a kind of navel gazy personal growth, weekend workshop, and then you go back to your life destroying job. And, so it doesn't inherently, one doesn't necessarily lead to the other. But I do think that as so many men have been domesticated within a anthropocentric context, right, where the priority of the human is essentially unchallenged, that there's a loss of orientation, right, of truly what does matter, right? And so the place of of nature as a place of mystery and of a vast intelligence far greater than any individual. There's a reason why there's this kind of core structure of what's known maybe broadly as the wilderness fast, right? The vision quest as a practice of essentially taking oneself out of ordinary reality and putting oneself in the face of the grand story, right? You could say that life itself. And having gone through a 4-year cycle of that myself, there's something that happens to you when your ego is consciously traumatized by such an encounter with such a vastness. And in the absence of eldership and mentorship, which is rightly gathering you back in from such an encounter, who helps you actually make meaning of that, which is that you yourself are not the center of the story, right? That there's a much bigger story out there called life itself. But that doesn't mean you're nobody, right? It just means you're part of the story. And for me, that's the function of culture, at least at that time, from adolescence to adulthood, to reorganize one's egoic structure into a sense of meaningful participation. And so nature as the place of that encounter has been vital and necessary as the non-human or the more than human world needs to be encountered as a way of, waking oneself up to this grander design. And so nature as this, it can then dangerously, though, become just simply a backdrop to a kind of fetishized, romanticized, more of me now is, nature wants me to be out there screaming at the trees and finding my wildness. And then I go back to my life destroying job. Like it can become that. Right. But I think in the core possibility, though, that lies there's a reason, again, that the wilderness was the place to go and then to come back transformed to the human realm.
You're listening to Non-Toxic. My conversation with Ian MacKenzie continues in a moment. This episode of Non-Toxic is sponsored by Blue Corn Candles. Based in Colorado, Blue Corn makes an amazing beeswax candle that burns cleanly, smells really good, and isn't made with anything derived from petroleum. Enter the code NONTOXIC20 on your first order to get 20% off. That's capital N, capital T, one word. If you like what you're hearing, now would be a great time to pause and rate and review this podcast. Help us detoxify the discourse and find more listeners. Now back to my conversation with Ian MacKenzie. To what extent do you think the mythopoets of this generation were embracing the insights of second wave feminism or reacting against them or doing something else entirely? I've read critiques more from like the later 90s and 2000s by pro-feminist men who often don't look kindly on the mythopoets because they view them as being quite apolitical and not really understanding the larger political meaning of the change in gender dynamics that second wave feminism brought in, that it was a very kind of individual focus a therapeutic focus, and that was, according to some commentators, that was a failing.
Mhm.
What's your sense of that?
Yeah, I'm recalling again my interview with Michael Mead, which was back in 2020. And he spoke to this where he said, look, people looked and they said, what do you think of the mythopoetic men's movement that's clearly arrived? Like reporters would ask him that. And he was clear to say it's not a movement. Like, don't confuse it with a movement. Often when a movement happens with men, it's, to war. So he actually framed it as it's soul work, primarily. It's soul work. So in that sense, the idea that it's not political to me makes sense, right? Because it is actually, in some sense, trying to recraft a cultural tapestry of what is absent for so many modern men, right? Again, like a mythos to bring a sense of meaning, a sense of mentorship, eldership, the power of story in order to illuminate a sense of relational magic, with the world, understanding the forces within oneself, right? Archetypes and these inner maps. And so, yeah, the fact that it wasn't political and somewhat remains apolitical to me makes sense. At the same time, I would say now, as one also who I believe has steeped myself more in a political framework and understands and has sought to understand feminist take and the value of certainly of it, is that, yeah, like they kind of need each other in a sense, but I wouldn't want to foist on as a critique that the mythopoetic impulse, let's say, or at least the way of gathering under soul work somehow has to be political by nature. I think that that can support a political consciousness when one makes that connection again to a deeper sense of meaning, a deeper sense of purpose that one carries in life. So I understand the critique, and also I think, yeah, it's a different framework that's being applied.
And perhaps it also had a broader appeal because it didn't explicitly embrace politics. I know that a lot of those pro-feminist men critics would throw up their hands with exasperation and say, like, why can't we get the same crowds that these guys are getting?
Totally.
What's going on? Um,
Yeah.
it, I know that there were in the 80s there was a strain of second wave feminism that sort of involved a lot of moon worship and the like, but has really fallen out of fashion, I would say. There's not a significant cohort of feminists who are into those ideas anymore, at least not in a kind of public way. Whereas it seems like after a brief dip in the late 90s and 2000s, these ideas for the men's movement have come roaring back. And I'm just very curious, like, what, in your opinion, explains this resurgence of mythopoetic, you could say, teachings or concepts, and kind of where are those new versions of it found?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, one thing about the women's side, I am curious. I do know, of course, yeah, there was a parallel movement, it seemed, with Clarissa Pinkole's SDs, Women Who Run with Wolves, Marion Woodman, who was also a contemporary of Bly. They collaborated on different things. And I mean, I think it's continued in some fashion and also is enjoying some sense of resurgence, at least in circles I move, where, again, this whole wild woman retreat and wild women immersion and worshiping the goddess and all that. As far as how that butts into the feminist ecosystem or feminist ecosystem for women, I'm a bit less clear on that. I do think that they're somewhat at odds with each other sometimes, perhaps in a similar way, where it's like, okay, great, worship the goddess, but can you denounce what's happening in Palestine right now? Genocide, like, as in, where's the if worshiping the goddess and praising women, and then but look what's happening over here. Can you talk about that, please? And that's often an uncomfortable tension, because I also think that what happens is this whole, like, yeah, the mythopoetic realm, the qualities of that, when it gets infused with capitalist and egoic individualism, right? Then you just have, again, this kind of eating up of real possibility of change happening and real culture being generated, but just, yeah, getting devoured by the capitalist machine once again and spat out as somehow revolutionary. So the danger is always there, and continues to be a challenge. But as far as the resurgence of the mythopoetic men's side, I can say, which was shown to me in a way when I talked to Bill from Mankind Project, Bill Koth, right? He said, the second wave feminism is really what kind of instigated the first wave mythopoetic men's movement. And I will say, though, in terms of the branches that grew from that, I do think maybe it's important to talk about, maybe you do in your article, the men's rights movement also branched out as a bit of a parallel, right, from the same kind of, oh, we got to do something about it. But for me, the men's rights movement often kind of pits women as the problem, right, or feminism as the problem, right? And you can see that right up to this day with the manosphere, to me, is the current incarnation of exactly that impulse, right? Which is now we're in opposition to feminism instead of seeing it, oh, it's like a challenge or an invitation into our own soul work, which mythopoetics, to me, is that call. But the Me Too movement as the challenge, right? To me, it was huge what sparked it. And I know the founders of Sacred Sons, again, a somewhat premier men's organization now, I would call it like a second wave mythopoetic men's organization. They very clearly state, I talked to the founders, that Me Too happened and was like, whoa, we got to do something about this, right? And so again, I see this interesting call and response, right, as this kind of invitation from the feminine, you could say from a mythopoetic lens, says, okay, no more, the trespass, the rape and the pillage and the exploitation of women. That's it. No more. What are you going to do about it, man? And then, oh, we got to do something about it. And various, responses spill out from that.
Yeah, I think the Me Too movement was absolutely the gauntlet that was thrown down and sparked a lot of interest on the part of men in these sorts of retreats, because a lot of men started examining their own lives, their behaviors. And I certainly think a lot of these men's retreats kind of answered that call in a sense. I'm curious to what extent you think the current wave is taking up the ideas from 1.0 and to what extent they're updating or riffing on them. And you mentioned earlier, there have been a lot of changes in our understanding of gender. Obviously, now trans people are a big visible part of life in a way that they weren't to the same extent in the 1980s and 1990s. That's going to kind of be challenging for gender essentialists. Like, how is the mythopoetic men's movement taking things from the past, but also engaging with what's happening now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, these are pretty key questions. I'd say one of the major blind spots was appropriation of indigenous culture, right? That often happened a lot within these spaces, and I mean, still does. And that can be like everything from, using indigenous words like aho, reflexively or unknowingly, or, smudging and different ritualistic aspects that, again, Bill Koth from MKP says shamelessly they borrowed from, or took, because they didn't know any better at the time, right? It just reflects the cultural poverty. And so I think, yeah, since then, and certainly organizations like MKP have tried to kind of reconcile with that and kind of release things that were appropriative. In terms of gender as well, again, it's interesting to just see how the different ways of responding to it, because there's some that will say, well, we need to be fully inclusive and, include non-binary or trans men, for example, in spaces. And like, that's a really strong political statement that they're making, right? Certain groups. And other groups are saying, well, maybe they have their own space, right? They have their own third lodge in order to develop the medicine that they bring. And that there's still important to have these more, I don't know, clearly defined gender spaces, for example. And as far as how I've operated there, I mean, I've explicitly sought trans guests to talk about this and, how do they contend with this? And it was one particular one, Genevieve Sophia Dow, who's a trans woman in the US, I think Santa Fe. And the way that she talks about gender was profoundly and somewhat delightfully kind of reconfiguring for what I understand masculinity is. And it was so much more than what it seemed to be a simplistic representation that even people think that trans people are holding, right, around this and kind of what is a woman or what is a man and kind of trying to collapse it again into, again, like very simplistic terms. So I also like the term queer, not so much as an identity label, but as a function, right? Or like a verb, right? To queer. So this conversation around trans, on non-binary and gender is queering these men's spaces, and many are contending with it differently. I personally, I have different offerings where I feel that the particular context of it is absolutely, I can say I'm welcoming trans experience and trans input and trans, participation. Absolutely. And then there's other circumstances where I feel a bit less clear actually. For example, we do erotic immersions with men, myself and my collaborator, Dave Forte, which is all about, again, resetting this kind of core link to the erotic as connection to life itself. And also releasing a lot of shame around a man's own sexual imprint or blueprint, right? Of how he came into his own sexual being. What were the circumstances? Was it shamed? Was it secret? All these ways in which men are essentially awkwardly or traumatizingly, entering into their erotic being. And so in that weekend, there is nudity in the weekend, right? There is within the space. And so for me, there is something inherently different when there is a female body in the space, right? The presence of breasts, the presence of a vulva, like that changes things for a group of men. I'm not saying for better or for worse, but it does change things. And so for me, it's about being intentional with how are we understanding that it would change things, and how would that change the space, and do we want that, for this particular context? Maybe, maybe not. So it's not just like an automatic, yes, of course, no problem, every space all the time, because I think that's kind of fooling ourselves. So that's just one example of how, I'm personally contending with it.
To what extent do you think, we've talked earlier about Me Too and the manosphere being a kind of backlash to the current feminist wave that I guess is maybe already crested. I often hear the term the crisis of masculinity. To what extent do you think the mythopoetic approach addresses that crisis, or do you think the crisis is actually overblown and maybe the stakes aren't quite as extreme as one sees in, the headlines of newspapers and magazines?
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting, because there's another series as well of a fellow, he's part of an organization in Edmonton called Next Gen Men, which I'm happy to pass along the info. But he did a whole sweeping survey of masculinity over the last 100 years, right? And one chapter is on the mythopoetic men's movement. But it was interesting that he went back to even like the 1900s and brought out specific cultural documents that spoke to, again, this same kind of tension, like masculinity is in crisis, or women want to feminize men, and like it was just there too as well, right? And so it seems like in every age there's this tension. Men have to be men, or like, no, we have to be more feminine, and they got to change, and there's crisis. So there's some flavor of that, I think, in every generation. And I would say that yes, we are in a time of particular turbulent rate of change and upheaval, right? And I think that there's a whole movement to kind of reconstitute what almost like like a romanticized 50s era Leave It to Beaver, it seems like, right? Of, I'm sure you heard the term trad wife, right? Which is, again, my understanding of this trend of a traditional wife, right? Like essentially who rejects the falseness of feminism and returns to the keeping of her, husband and the family. And that was the rightful place of her. And it seems in some ways archaic, but when I kind of, step back a bit, I'm like, wow, this is very understandable, because it is very confusing to be in such a time of, yeah, I would almost call it an inability to come up with any kind of objective sense of what is right, right? Like if all subjectivities are all accurate and fair, and nothing means anything, and anybody can be any gender, and like I can see why in the confusion. It's like, can we just go back to when it felt simple, or even just a romanticized version of when it was simple? And I have a friend that points out that 50s and 60s, all that sense of Leave It to Beaver was, of course, a veneer that many women lived under, violence and the threat of violence constantly, and the sense that they were just happy housewives, like that has its own, obviously, like significant problems. But the impulse to try to return to a simpler time makes sense to me. And so I'd say for now, yes, the major question that I hold is, what kind of masculinity is asked for now, right? Which is not what kind of universal masculinity is asked for everywhere at all times. It's a return to a kind of subjective relationality to the place and the time that we're in, which to me seems to be what I understand when I talk to Indigenous guests, in particular around masculinity. I don't have an Indigenous guest typically who says, this is how masculinity is for us and should be for everyone, right? They're like, well, this is how we do it, right? This is how our people hold this question, or how masculinity shows up. And that to me is very telling, right? That they're not trying to implant another universal sacred masculinity on everybody. They're just saying, well, this is how we do it. And so for me, that return again to specificity feels more important than trying to enforce some new universalism.
I know that you've mentioned climate change on your show, which is in a way the kind of big shadow overlooking my show, Non-Toxic, as well. It's the sense that there are planetary stakes to this question of what men will do, especially because men have in recent years rejected climate science to a much greater degree than women have. And the leading climate denialists are pretty much all men, and their climate denial is often linked to other kind of patriarchal and reactionary views and kind of threat of violence to enforce them. Robert Bly, like I'm sure he, for most of his adult life, climate change wasn't really something that was discussed. But the founders of Sacred Sons, like if they were born any time after 1980, they've been hearing about climate change their whole lives. Like, to what extent is that a part of the current mythopoetic men's conversation?
Great question. I think, and again, I know a bit of Sacred Sons just from, I spoke to the founders in different contexts. I attended one of their convergences, and I appreciate what they're doing. And I can see where there's, maybe some
And
concerns
I just
around.
use them as an example. Like
Exactly.
I'm
Yeah,
not
yeah,
choosing them, singling them
for
out. I
sure.
just know that they're a visible group.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so I would say based on that, that their approach as captured in their branding and their intent, it seems, is to connect men with their hearts, right? That's sort of their slogan, as well as brotherhood is the medicine, things like that. And so if I'm like, okay, how does that serve climate change, right? And I think there is something to be said that if a man is out of contact with his capacity to feel and to experience empathy and compassion for another, it makes complete sense, right? That the inability to actually see the consequence of multitudes of actions and the harm created on legions and millions of other people, certainly in the global south, from climate change, like it makes sense. If you can't feel, you can't understand and be willing to change, right? So there is a sense that there's a kind of necessity to kind of wake up to oneself as a relational being of consequence and to feel empathy again, right? And I think, you use the term patriarchal culture, and that often gets the term that's used. And I haven't really found another word that is as maybe descriptive in that sense. I do know that authors like Riane Eisler, who wrote The Chalice and the Blade, she uses the term domination culture, right? Domination culture versus partnership culture. And at least that makes sense to me from that. If we talk about patriarchy, I think what we're talking about is essentially a culture of domination, which requires a kind of emotional castration for men, right? That they have to exist within this constant unconscious or overt power hierarchy. They have to be able to perform certain ways, and that means cutting off essentially their capacity to feel often and their capacity to feel empathy for others. And so it's courageous in a way then to be willing to step outside that pyramid hierarchy, as much as it also is, of course, causing mayhem for so many, including the people within it, right? Including the narcissists, sociopaths, within it. It's like, you can't tell me they're happy as much as they might appear to be. So yes, there needs to be a deep kind of architectural reformation. But for me as well, like if you can't feel first, it's like, then you're not really going to go anywhere. I will say the other piece though, the mythopoetics could offer is a mythic framework for what's happening, right? Like, I spoke with one guest, his name is Rune Harno from Sweden, I believe, or Denmark. And he talked about Ragnarok, right? The sort of ancient myth of apocalypse that he uses to be able to illuminate, right? The times that, wait, we've been here before mythically, right? Maybe not in exactly the same conditions, but we've been here mythically. Maybe it's not ice giants and whatever, traipsing around the countryside, but this sense of a kind of total existential moment, right? And how did we navigate it? And for me, I understand that stories and myth are time capsules of possibility of how we've done this before, right? And how we might relate to this now as it comes again, which is very different than a logical top down, this is how we engage, right? It's much more mysterious than that, but possibly reveals pathways that we don't know yet.
Yeah, because I would say, telling people how many degrees centigrade we have until collapse, like it hasn't been very effective.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not a mythic, it's not a noble invitation, right? I think into a hero's journey in some ways.
I guess to wrap up this conversation, what do you think like is next for the mythopoetic men's movement? It's been growing, it seems, at a rapid clip the past few years. It's hard for me to really get a sense from the outside of what those numbers are, but it seems to be entering a new phase of public visibility.
I wonder how it will look, and again, like one more example from Sacred Sons. Like when I attended their convergence, this is back in 2019. They were doing a particular process which is called, in the Mankind Project, it's called carpet work, but really it's sort of like psychodrama, shadow work, and I won't go into the full particulars, but essentially it's going to shadow realms facilitated by one or two facilitators and can be quite intense. But I experienced it first in the Mankind Project, a version of it, which was quite powerful for me in terms of my own process and, reclaiming a core foundational trust in men. Like it was quite significant for me. But Sacred Sons, the similar kind of process, I remember being there and supporting as a sort of assistant. But there was a guy in the background playing like the Han drum, you know, like, and I never made that connection. I'm like, oh, that's a really cool idea actually to play the Han drum, while this like intense process is going on. And it mixed in elements that I had experienced at transformational festivals, like Burning Man. And so it was just interesting to me to see, oh, this is what part of this infusion is looking like as a different generation picks up the torch, right? It's using some of the elements of the mythopoetic, bringing in aspects learned from a different subculture, the transformational, festival subculture, and then certainly a deeper and renewed kind of trauma-informed somatic, breath work, like all that seems to be ice baths. I kind of joked that men's work these days was like 90%, cold plunges, but
Like
that
men
also
would
seems to
rather
be part.
jump in a tub of ice than go to therapy.
Well, exactly. And some might say, right, that's way more effective to be in a cold tub. But there's something to that, right? Like an infusion now of these other ingredients that have been learned since the first wave. Now, overall, I would just say the danger I see is that it remains primarily therapeutic, personally therapeutic, right? Like that's the farce is like they say best thing you can do is change yourself. I say, forget it. You can work on yourself enough to be useful in the process of cultural regeneration. That to me is the most valuable amount of self-work, because then the culture itself begins to, swirl around and become this organism itself that hopefully, is the thing that we actually give our next generations instead of a planet like Wall-E, with robots combing through our debris.
And on that note, I think we can end our conversation. Ian, thank you so much for sharing some insights with your exploration in the mythic masculine. I think there's a lot that I was curious about. I don't know to what extent I will be doing some of these practices for myself. I think I kind of lean on the skeptical side of things, but I'm also just, I'm a curious person, and I know that like there are a lot of different ways of communicating and that people respond to different paths, I suppose. And so it's like, if this is where people are, like how do you meet them there? So that's kind of what drew me to this. And I really appreciate the expertise that you've built up. So yeah, really, really helpful primer.
Thanks, Daniel. And come to a weekend, experience it yourself. And then
All right.
I'd be curious to see how it lands for you.
That'll be the next step. All right. Thank you so much. And that's it for this episode of Non-Toxic. I'm your host, Daniel Penny. If you'd like to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/non-toxic-podcast and sign up for membership today. We've got some very nice perks on offer, and we appreciate any support that you can help us with. We also would really appreciate it if you could rate and review the show. It's how the algorithm pushes us out to other potential listeners. So keep the robots happy. Our music is by Nathan Sharp, and our artwork is by Sam Creasy. More soon.